Hello, I'm Ellen Binns coming today from Wheaton, Illinois in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in Essex in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's August 29th, 2024.
So, continuing the spectacular display of talent, endurance, and skill shown by athletes competing in this summer's Paris Olympics, this week, indeed the day before we're recording, sees the start of the Paralympic Games, which run between 28th of August and 8th of September. For us, in many ways, the Paralympic Games represents an even more remarkable display of dedication and talent to the Games that have just ended, given the challenges many competitors have had to overcome in order to earn their place in their national team squads. Some have grown up with what us fully able-bodied and mentally unimpaired folks might consider a disability. Others have had their lives changed by sudden injury or another event, including among those military veterans, serving police officers and other emergency workers, as well as many more. All have shown remarkable perseverance, positivity, and courage on their journeys. As we marvel at the performances by athletes in many sports, this week we turn our attention to the wider challenges faced by impaired people worldwide, many of whom have overcome great challenges to inspire through their achievements in many fields, not to mention in raising families, supporting others, and more. We're also excited to tell the story of someone, a mother known to Ellen, whose daughter will be among the more than 4,000 athletes taking part in the Games in Paris these next few days. We love the Paralympics and hope you too will have opportunities to watch and cheer on these amazing athletes as Paris once again provides, looking at the opening ceremony yesterday, we know what a wonderful stage it is, provides a dramatic stage for what is going to be a real breathtaking spectacle. So to begin our deep dive, let's start with clarifying a few basics. And here we've learned quite a few things that have really opened our eyes.
And I just want to clarify that the person that I know is the partner of my friend's daughter.
Yes, sorry, I'm getting...
That's okay. No, it's confusing, but yes. So I don't actually know Caitlin, but I know her partner's mother firsthand. So how many people globally are thought to have an impairment of some kind? This was astonishing to me. According to estimates by the World Health Organization, around 1.3 billion people worldwide are thought to have some form of significant disability or impairment, representing about 16% of the global population, or roughly 1 in 6 people. This number has been increasing over time due to aging populations and rising rates of chronic health conditions in many countries, although still around 80% of persons with disabilities live in developing countries. Mobility impairments, visual impairments, hearing impairments, and intellectual disabilities are most common.
Quite a striking number, isn't it, really? When I first read this statistic, I immediately thought, well, it's because we have an aging population. And, as we get older, we do tend to suffer, physical and mental impairments of some sort. But my goodness, 80% living in developing countries where the population generally is quite young compared with the West. Now, quite a key question that we reflected on is how should we describe people with an impairment? And not to be embarrassed here, some of us may not always know how to refer to people with impairments in a way that is inclusive, respectful, and doesn't cause unnecessary offence. I think a lot of us can be trying to be politically correct, can't we? We
Yes.
sort of tiptoe around something and possibly even cause more offence than we realise by doing that. Not offence.
It's hard. I think we should ask for grace in case we make a mistake in this
Exactly.
podcast.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. This does seem to be one area where at least trying to use the right words matters, but again, without overdoing that pussyfooting kind, if I can use those words. And we found ourselves pondering this key question. So sought out some advice from the UK's Equal Representation Coalition and more. Here's what they recommend. Firstly, use person-first language. In other words, put the person before the disability. So in other words, you would say person with autism rather than leading with a disability, such as autistic person, unless the person themselves describes themselves using their identity first, which actually can be quite common among the autistic and also the deaf communities. Secondly, they recommend when referring to a group, use disabled people or people with disabilities, not the disabled. Similarly, refer to a wheelchair user instead of they are confined to a wheelchair, or, for example, to a person with epilepsy rather than epileptic, and so on. Also avoid medical labels or terms that imply pity, like I've already done this, haven't I? Suffers from or afflicted with. Again, very easy for us to drop into that kind of language. Neutral language like has a condition is best to use, rather than negative phrases like, as we've said, suffers from a particular condition.
Euphemisms like differently abled, special needs, and handy capable are condescending and can be seen as patronizing. They're not necessarily accurate either, so avoid using these. Thankfully, society seems to have largely moved on from talking about the handicapped in recent decades. It's true that language preferences can vary among individuals and communities. So, where possible, ask people how they prefer to be described and always focus on the person and their preferences before their impairment. This sounds like very helpful advice that many of us might do well to take note of. It's possibly something that some of us give little thought to, but with a little mindfulness, we might avoid inadvertently upsetting or appearing to patronize our impaired friends when we meet them, and avoid further unsettling them by obviously tiptoeing around everything we say. And even as we're watching the Paralympics, we're going to be describing events and what we've seen, and this could be a helpful place to practice these, being aware of what we're saying.
Very much so. So we thought we would talk a little bit about the Paralympics first of all. And one question that came to us right away was, where did this word come from? The Paralympics. Curious word, obviously referring to the major sporting event now in progress. Apparently, the word has its origins in the early 1950s and is a blend of the word paraplegic and Olympic. It's believed that it was first coined by the paraplegic athletes during the Stoke Mandeville Games in the UK, which were organised by Dr. Ludwig Guttmann, who was a pioneer in rehabilitation through sport. Stoke Mandeville, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is a renowned spinal injuries hospital, very well known here in the UK. The prefix para is derived from the Greek word meaning beside or alongside, which also indicates that the Paralympics exist alongside the Olympics. The first official Paralympic Games were held in Rome in 1960. Initially, they were focused on spinal injuries, but the Games, as we know, have since expanded to include athletes with various disabilities, marking a significant evolution in the scope and inclusivity of the event.
So, what qualifications are needed to be a Paralympian? To become a Paralympian, athletes need to meet several key qualifications and requirements. They obviously must have an eligible impairment, which the International Paralympic Committee, the IPC, classifies under 10 categories, including physical impairments like impaired muscle power, limb deficiency, hypertonia and ataxia, vision impairment, and intellectual impairment. The impairment must be permanent and present a competitive disadvantage in sport. And in the case of intellectual impairment, be defined as a restriction in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, which affects conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills required for everyday life. And the impairment must be present before the age of 18. So, for example, an athlete who is judged to have impaired muscle power, one of the 10 categories, will, according to the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, have a health condition that either reduces or eliminates their ability to voluntarily contract their muscles in order to move or to generate force, such as a spinal cord injury, muscular dystrophy, and spina bifida. Whereas one with an impaired passive range of movement has a restriction or a lack of passive movement in one or more joints. An example here is a trauma affecting a joint.
Summer events do allow full abled participants to compete where needed. An obvious example here is blind football, where the B1, we'll talk about the classification system in a minute. The B1 classification signifies very low visual acuity and or no light perception, with all outfield players needing to wear eye shades to ensure fair competition. You can just imagine that people have different levels of light perception in a team sport, but that is where you're passing a ball. It's very difficult to ensure fairness without something like this. However, the goalkeeper can be fully sighted or partially sighted, which I didn't know.
No, I didn't know that either.
No, interesting. Now, the nature of impairment also varies depending on the sport. For example, in powerlifting, athletes have a functional limitation of the lower limbs or hips that prevents them from practicing standing weightlifting and are able to compete together, therefore, in different body weight categories. Such functional limitations include orthopedic disability, cerebral palsy, neurological disability, paraplegia and tetraplegia, and progressive neurological disability. Now, to ensure fair competitiveness, as we've said, different ratings are used to classify events, these being determined by skill, fitness, power, endurance, tactical ability, and mental focus. Classifications are designated by a letter, usually the sport's initial and a number. For example, the initial S indicates swimming. Generally, although not always, the lower the figure, the greater the impairment.
Good information for watching the Paralympics.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a Paralympian? What are the challenges and the triumphs? Being a Paralympian is a remarkable achievement that encompasses both significant challenges and incredible triumphs. It requires years of hard work and training involving competing at progressively higher levels from local to national to international events. And of course, intensive training and regularly competing in events are also needed for able-bodied athletes to reach elite performance levels. However, Paralympians must also overcome other obstacles, including physical, societal, educational, transportation, and employment challenges. Being a Paralympian means embodying the spirit of perseverance, challenging social perceptions of disability, and pursuing a dream, often in the face of seemingly unsurmountable challenges. Just to give one example of the challenges most Paralympians face, the Sports Financial Literacy Academy points to the many financial challenges of competing, including a lack of sponsorship and endorsement opportunities, not attracting the same level of corporate interest as Olympic athletes due to poor media coverage and public awareness of Paralympic sports. I think that's changing, but limited sponsorship and some grants may be available to some, but most Paralympians often have to rely on personal funding to provide their training, and often specific and expensive travel and equipment needs. In some cases, Funding is also needed for personal care assistants or guides to travel alongside them. Even if they reach the medal podium, the prize money and financial rewards for Paralympic events are generally far lower than those for Olympic events. So even the most successful Paralympians tend to earn significantly less compared to their Olympic counterparts.
While these challenges are faced by all Paralympians, some other barriers and challenges relate to whether one is born with an impairment or become impaired through a life-changing event. The Athlete Support Network, the Performance Room, notes that Paralympic athletes who have been born with a disability learn about managing their challenges very early on in life. Generally, their resilience comes from an early acceptance of their condition as being normal and a focus on performing with that disability. Parents and other key adult figures will be influential in how they view themselves and choose their attitude. Some of the best and most inspirational examples of athletes, according to the Performance Room, are those who adopt an opportunity rather than a challenge mindset. In other words, they accept their disability completely. They don't see it as an impediment, but the reality and, at times, an opportunity, who are acutely aware and focused on what they can do, knowing what strengths they have. They know how they dealt with challenge before. The Performance Room also note the resilience shown by athletes who have experienced a disabling event, noting that the impact of a sudden trauma on the psychological self, as well as the physical self, is huge. Overnight, they say, who you are and what you're capable of changes, and that sometimes traumatic change in identity is likely to be the greatest psychological challenge you have ever faced. You don't just have to practically learn how to function differently. You have to process and face that you are different, that what you're capable of is likely to be different, and you'll have a different future than what you'd previously envisaged. As with those born with an impairment, mindset here is again key, being essential to adjust to the change and focus on the goal of becoming a high performer. This involves, according to the Performance Room, having an inner sense of confidence and calmness, awareness of what's helped them come through the worst, and proactively building a resilience recipe that they follow on a daily basis.
Mebster, a Prague-based organization that supports both carers of the impaired and those who have an impairment to maximize their potential, concludes that what makes Paralympic athletes special is their determination to succeed, no matter what stands in their way. Each Paralympian has a unique story. Mebster says, but they all share one thing. They don't let their circumstances define them. Whether they were born with a disability or acquired one later in life, these athletes have faced their challenges head on and turned them into opportunities to grow and achieve. Their journeys remind us that with perseverance, anything is possible. How true, inspiring, and perhaps challenging for each of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what, for me, is one of the real joys of the Paralympics is just hearing so many stories. And my goodness, Ellen, you know the mother of the partner of one of those who's going to be competing this week in Paris.
Yes, it has been so interesting to hear about her journey, and exciting that actually Tammy leaves tomorrow, Friday, to go to Paris with her daughter to watch Caitlin. Caitlin is on the Paralympic basketball team for the USA. And I talked with Tammy a little bit about what her experience has been getting to know Caitlin and spending a lot of time with her, traveling with her, and seeing what Caitlin faces every day. And, it's really humbling. Obviously, Caitlin has succeeded in, what we've talked about, the emotional, that she's been in a wheelchair since birth and has mastered that incredibly when you hear the stories. But the situations that they have found themselves in as a family, it's really interesting. Like they went to a Chicago Cubs baseball game, and there was no elevator.
Oh,
So
goodness.
Allie had to carry her 20
That's
stairs.
extraordinary,
And
isn't
I
it?
mean, there are elevators there, but in a certain,
Yeah.
part of the building.
Mm.
And they went to another baseball game, and they were in front row seats, and the people that worked there wanted to take Allie's wheelchair from her. And she said, but I need it. And, if I need to go to the bathroom or something, and they were like, well, that's just too bad. And it, stressful for her to have her wheelchair out of sight. That's a custom made wheelchair for her. And if there's an emergency, she would need that. But they're just like, no, sorry. And like in historic towns, there's usually no ramps for her. High tops in restaurants are, difficult for her. We don't think about that.
No.
And, even you think about the accessibility of beach wheelchairs, but she can't do that herself. Someone has to push that for her on the beach.
Mm.
And, like when she's pushing her wheelchair, her hands get dirty. And, if the ground is dirty, or if there's
very tired as well, I would imagine. My goodness.
Yeah. Just these little things we don't think about. She does drive. She's had some really interesting stories with cars, if they break down and she's by. It's fascinating, but she has mastered it. And Tammy talks about Caitlin's mother and how she really empowered Caitlin to figure it out. Figure it out. And it made Caitlin so much stronger.
Yeah. So absolutely remembering the parents or those who are responsible for raising children with an impairment, their approach, the wisdom they need, I guess, in that often. And to be a parent of any sort is tough.
Right.
My goodness.
Right.
When there's this extra need there. And dealing with all these situations, facing in public, attitudes, carefree, or lack of care, shall we say.
And, there's so many times there's no malicious intent. We are just not thinking. It's not in our consciousness. And, like I said, sometimes I ask for grace because something has slipped past me. And when you hear these stories, I think, oh my gosh, I never thought of that. Or she does talk too about people asking her for help and she doesn't need help. And I said to Tammy, but that's hard because you don't know what to do.
No.
Do I ask someone if they need help? She said the key is to ask them if they want help. That's what she prefers. And if she says no, honor that. She does not need help.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's very, very useful for us to hear, isn't it? And to know.
Yeah, she's an incredible young lady.
Sounds like it. And my goodness, basketball. How quickly they whiz around. And wow, that's going to be quite something to see. So let's really well that Caitlin's whole time in Paris and that of her partner and family is one of joy, adventure, and forming new friendships, which again is one of the great joys of the Paralympics, I think. We will for her to give her best and to savor the excitement and energy of performing on a global stage, and to take great pride in the remarkable achievement of representing her country in such a prestigious event. It's a total triumph for all of those athletes to be there, of course.
Yes.
So moving on a little bit from the Paralympics to consider how do attitudes towards and regulations aimed to support people with disabilities vary around the world. Many of the challenges faced by Paralympians are common to all people who have an impairment. The opportunities to confront these and attitudes of the societies in which they live towards people with an impairment vary considerably, depending, of course, on where they live. Similarly, regulations aimed to support people with disabilities vary significantly around the world, reflecting differences in cultural perspectives, economic resources, and political priorities. However, there has been a global trend towards greater recognition of disability rights and increased efforts to promote inclusion and accessibility. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities serves as a crucial international framework for disability rights aimed at encouraging all countries to abolish discrimination against persons with disabilities and eliminate barriers towards the full enjoyment of their rights and their inclusion in society. The treaty, which has been ratified by numerous countries, aims to promote, protect, and ensure full and equal enjoyment of all human rights for people with disabilities. It covers areas such as accessibility, independent living, education, employment, and participation in political and cultural life. European Union member states, Japan, Australia, and the United States are among countries that have instituted its obligations in national legislation and taken significant steps to support people with disabilities. For example, the EU Disability Rights Strategy for 2021 to 2030 focuses on improving accessibility, inclusion, and equal opportunities, while in the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a landmark piece of legislation that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in various aspects of public life, including in employment, education, and transportation. Nonetheless, approaches vary across many parts of the world, although many countries have implemented regulations to ensure both physical and digital, that is, online accessibility, with an increasing emphasis on making public spaces, transportation, and information technologies accessible. The UN lists legislation that has been passed by each member nation on its website. We'll put the link for this in our show notes. Efforts to promote equal employment opportunities for people with disabilities are common, though the effectiveness of these measures varies. Inclusive education policies that aim to integrate students with disabilities into mainstream education are also becoming more common, along with an increasing focus on supporting people with an impairment to live independently. Despite much progress, significant challenges remain, not least actually implementing changes and enforcing existing laws. Budget constraints limit public works to be more user-friendly for people with impairments, even in many richer nations, while the attitudes and stigma attached to those who have an impairment sadly still persist in some societies.
So, how can we individually become more inclusive of people who have a physical or mental impairment? A mutual friend of ours who has a visual impairment once remarked, "I often get invited to the party, but very rarely do I get invited to dance." And Maya is an incredible person.
Yeah.
We feel that. This reflection has stuck with us and caused us to ponder how we can be more mindful to ensure that we don't just regard inclusiveness as being about inviting our impaired friends to join us, but are actively mindful of what it means for them to be involved in the dance and doing our best to make sure that they are invited to join us on the dance floor. Becoming more inclusive, of course, ensures that venues we choose for any events we host are accessible, and where possible, appropriate signage is also offered, such as Braille translations of guidance notes, engaging help from sign language interpreters, and using clear, simple language in communications. And as we mentioned earlier, we might be helpful to use inclusive people-first languages. And when we're planning events, involve people with disabilities in the design, implementation, and evaluation of the activity. This may be one example of how we can create opportunities for people with disabilities to participate in community activities.
Perhaps most importantly, we might seek advice from people with impairments themselves. And that seemed to be the real message Caitlin had as well, I think. So that we can understand what will specifically enable them to feel that they can fully participate in what is on offer. And in so doing, we might begin to appreciate perspectives that those of us who do not have impairments may not be mindful of. I remember trying to do this when I was putting together a website some years ago and really seeking advice on someone with visual impairments about how they might navigate that and how audio description might be used, for example. And we might will that we can be more mindful to sensitively ask how we might include people in activities we engage in a way that is fully inclusive and act on opportunities to invite such participation. As we were saying earlier, just being mindful really here. And also becoming more aware of the many different ways in which people with impairments are affected, things that we may just overlook, just not be aware of. The difficulty of navigating websites is one example that completely escaped me, really. Of course, when it's pointed out, it's obvious, but if you don't have that difficulty generally yourself, it's not something you necessarily appreciate when you're doing something like a website design. Similarly, the heightened sensitivity that many people on the autistic spectrum have towards bright lights and certain sounds is another which may escape the attention of many of us who do not share their experience.
Where might we hone in with our prayers and intentions for those who have disabilities? So in researching this episode, quite a few areas for our prayer and intention focus became clear to us. As always, this is far from a comprehensive list, although among topics that struck us where we might hold intentions are willing that all governments and policymakers and authorities responsible for regulation and implementation of public projects, they're mindful of their international obligations for not discriminating against people with impairments and making their lives easier. Similarly, willing that all employers everywhere in the world take their obligations towards enforcing non-discrimination policy, and that all commercial organizations such as new home and business property construction companies prioritize accessibility for people with impairments over pure profit. We will that there is wisdom for those involved in educating children, not to mention adults as well, to know how to design curricular activities to foster an appreciation of difference and bring awareness to the differing experiences of people with impairments, to challenge attitudes, and to highlight where every member of society can play their part encouraging inclusivity. And be their advocates, right? When somebody's in a situation that's not accessible for them, to be an advocate.
Yeah, calling out those who are being deliberately discriminatory.
Yes.
And we might will for more urgent dialogue between those who have an impairment and those who are involved in planning and implementing activities, be these at a community level or otherwise, and also to will for a greater readiness for those with impairments to come forward and explain what they need will best help them, and crucially as well, for those who are involved in the planning and implementation to listen to their voices and act upon their requests and meet these requests when they are able. Of course, we might hope, too, that those with impairments will themselves be involved very actively in planning and implementing such events, if not indeed initiating them and having responsibility for them as well. And finally, as we marvel at the talent and perseverance of those athletes taking part in the Paralympic Games in Paris this week, including Caitlin, let's will that we are all inspired by their example to honor, celebrate, and value disability. May we each take inspiration from their perseverance, courage, and ability to overcome great challenges and adversity, remembering that as we age, all of us will need to adapt to living with more limited function than we may have now.
So this week, we might consider how each one of us individually can take steps to become more inclusive of people with impairments. We therefore suggest as our special intention focus for this week to be that we will always be mindful of and have wisdom to know how to be as fully inclusive as possible of people we may meet who have an impairment when planning activities, entertaining others, and in general conversation, whether their impairment is known to us or otherwise. Please join us in holding this. And if you yourself have an impairment, you may wish to especially focus the intention on willing greater awareness of where others may best have wisdom to ensure that you not only get invited to the party, but you feel fully a part of the dance. If this includes you, Please do share on the Facebook group what we all can do to make this happen. And again, we're asking for your grace if we have made any errors in this podcast that are offensive or inappropriate.
Yes. We tried our best, but we are.
Yes, we tried our best.
Yeah. So do let us know. That about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in my daily Insight Timer offerings, and with Ellen in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out too for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us in Holding Intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime, thank you, go well, stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Vince and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.